we say that we want to have children and look after them well. We say we want to look after the disabled and the growing army of the elderly. But actually, when it comes to it, freedom tends to kind of trump the more traditional obligations of family life.
I don't see being married to the state throughout your entire life as a trade that was such a good value.
We've always known, obviously, that GDP never counted lots of valuable, productive work. All the productive work that was being done in the home doesn't count towards GDP. A car crash causes GDP to rise because of, people have to buy new cars and all the work involved in scraping somebody off the motorway. So, we've known that GDP is always, has quite a narrow focus. But the problem, or rather the tension between GDP economics and, as it were, human economics, I do think we're sort of setting ourselves up to fail with the way in which sort of GDP completely dominates the public mind on all of this is something we've got to sort of wean ourselves off.
There is one thing that I find it's very, very uncomfortable for us to even contemplate, and it is that we humans require an awful lot of care. And for some of us, we will require probably as much care from others as we spend our independent lives. So we obviously need the care in the childhood, adulthood, and then in the elderly, or in the years when we are older. Given how much time we spend relying on other people's care, you would imagine that the system that we've got that provides that is quite robust. But from knowing anything that I know and from reading your work, that is definitely not the case.
No, indeed. We are very unusual mammals. I think we're the only mammals whose offspring are not self-sufficient at all, really, for 5, 6, 7 years, and then semi-self-sufficient for several years beyond that. And we require a very high degree of care at the beginning and the end of our lives. And obviously, as societies have become richer in the last 50, 100 years, we do spend a lot more on care outside the family, outside the home. The state has a much bigger role. We spend vastly more on care than we did 50 or 100 years ago. We talk constantly about care, self-care, the caring corporation. Care is sort of ubiquitous in some ways, and yet it's sort of care in the general. And when it comes to care in the particular, we are much less good because so much status has flooded out of the domestic realm into the public realm over that same period. And here we are. We're an aging society with plunging fertility, and we need to invest more in the domestic realm. We need to we should stop regarding it as a kind of backwater. And of course, there is this tension, which is why I've just written this book called The Care Dilemma. There's a tension between modern freedoms, perhaps particularly the freedoms that women have achieved in the last 50 or 60 years, and investing sufficiently in the care that we say that we want. We say that we want to have children and look after them well. We say we want to look after the disabled and the growing army of the elderly. But actually, when it comes to it, freedom tends to kind of trump the more traditional obligations of family life, particularly in a very liberal society like Britain's. And I like to say that it is a dilemma. Compare life in the UK today with 50 years ago. We're much richer, we're much better educated. We're much freer to choose our own life path, particularly if we're a woman. On the other hand, we're much more likely to live alone. We're much more likely to suffer from depression. We're much less likely to have children. And if we are a child, we are much less likely to live in a stable family with our two biological parents. So we've got all these complicated trade-offs, but I mean, my basic thesis is that we've got out of kilter. We need to reinvest in the domestic realm. We need to raise its status without losing the freedoms that have been achieved in the last few decades. Those are obviously very valuable things, and and I my new book, The Care Dilemma: Caring Enough in the Age of Sex Equality, is, I like to say rather grandly, the third in a kind of trilogy. I coined the terms in the first book of the trilogy, The Road to Somewhere. I coined the terms the people who see the world from anywhere and the people that see the world from somewhere, the so-called anywheres and somewheres. That came out in 2017. It was an attempt to kind of understand. It was a sort of sympathetic understanding of populism in a way. I started writing it just before the Brexit vote in 2016, and I finished writing it just as Donald Trump was elected for the first time in November of that year, and it came out in early 2017. It was one of the first. It did well. I was very briefly, just for 1 week, I was in the bestseller list at number 10. So it's been it's sold a lot more than the subsequent two books. Partly because the good timing. People were looking around for an explanation of why society seemed to have politics seemed to have gone a bit crazy with Brexit, Trump, and so on. And the basic thesis of The Road to Somewhere was that we had these new or kind of newish divides in politics, value divides in politics that had partly eclipsed the traditional socioeconomic class-based form that politics took in most Western European countries. Arguments about the size of the state, market versus state, redistribution, how much support the middle and the top should give to the bottom, and so on and so forth. And those issues obviously haven't gone away completely, but they've been sort of eclipsed by more almost sort of social psychological issues relating to people's identities and sense of their country and what's happening to it, national identity, borders, immigration. Those kinds of issues rose up. And they tended to divide people along educational lines, partly. So you had these value divides. The Anywheres, the group I called the Anywheres. And by the way, I invented the labels. I didn't invent these worldview groups. They're very much there if you look at things like British social attitude surveys and so on. They are there for everybody to see. But the Anywheres, you are perhaps otherwise known as kind of the liberal graduate class. Not everybody who's a graduate is liberal, but probably a majority of people who go to university tend to go through a liberalising experience, perhaps particularly in this country, because we're international outliers in the number of people that go to residential universities. They leave their home town and their family, and they join often a whole new network of connection, friends and contacts. And anywheres tend to, partly because of that experience of mobility, anywheres tend to favour mobility and autonomy and openness. They're comfortable with social change. That's probably the key factor, because they've sort of experienced it in their own lives often. Whereas the Somewheres, who are a much larger but less influential group, I mean, the Somewheres, I estimated around half the population. Anywheres about a quarter, and then there's a group I call the in-betweeners, who sort of share a mixture of the two worldviews. But the Somewheres, who tend to be less well educated and much more connected to where they come from, and their identities. There's a very useful, I think, very helpful way of thinking about this. It's actually not original to me, but a famous American sociologist called Tolkien Parsons, who talks about achieved and all human beings are on a spectrum with a mix of achieved and ascribed identities. So if you're on anywhere, much of your identity is in a sense achieved, or it's easy to consider yourself a product of your own achievements in a way. You've done well at school, you've gone to a more or less good university, you have you're in a relatively high status professional job. So you tend to think of yourself as you tend to think of your identity as a kind of an achieved identity. Whereas for most people still, even in a rich country like Britain, where people are reasonably well educated, their sense of themselves is more connected to those immutable things about themselves, the things that are ascribed at birth, kind of thing. So you're a white male northern working class, and if your sense of yourself is derived more from place and group, as it is from many some ways, then you're clearly going to find social change much more uncomfortable. And I think that is quite a helpful way of looking at the reason why some people felt very drawn to the Brexit protest vote, because both of these worldviews are perfectly decent worldviews. The problem has been in our politics probably since the mid-1990s is that one of those groups, the Anywheres, have been far too dominant. Both political parties, all of politics is dominated by Anywheres. The culture is dominated by Anywheres. The business, everything tends to be dominated by Anywheres, and Anywheres tend to assume that everybody is like them. But that ain't the case. Anyway, that book came out, as I said, it did relatively well. I then followed it up a couple of years later with a book that came out just around pandemic time, called Head, Hand, Heart: The Struggle for Dignity and Status in the 21st Century. And it sort of developed the thesis focusing very much on the idea of education, and higher education in particular, creating a new kind of cognitive meritocracy. And the idea there really was that we had overemphasized one form of human aptitude, the sort of cognitive, analytical, exam passing type intelligence, the kind of pattern recognition type intelligence, which is an incredibly important form of intelligence. We need clever people, probably more than ever in some ways, to sort out some of the messes that we've got into in human society of climate change, etc. So this is not against. This is not an anti-intellectual book or anything. It's just saying that there are other forms of human aptitude, practical manual abilities. Some people are just very good with their hands. They have craft skills. And emotional intelligence. Some people are very good at caring for the young, for the old, for reading people's emotions, for responding to them in appropriate ways, and so on. And those other forms of intelligence have been rather devalued in recent time, and we've had a very narrow sense of what it is to lead a successful life, as I mentioned a bit earlier. That's that kind of route to that route to doing well academically and then into a knowledge economy professional job has become too narrow a sense of successful life. And indeed the idea of meritocracy, of course we're all in favor of meritocracy, at least in some sense. Nobody wants to be operated on by somebody who's failed their surgery exams. So we want the right people in the right jobs, and that probably particularly applies to the high status professional and managerial jobs. We want an open elite, obviously, but the merit in meritocracy, I argue, has been too narrowly defined around that form of exam passing analytical intelligence. And we need a broader definition of the merit in meritocracy. Anyway, the third book, the one that just came out a few months ago, The Care Dilemma, looks at, I think, what is another big sort of failing of the dominant anywhere worldview, which is that it's a very, very public realm oriented worldview. It regards the domestic realm as a kind of backwater, something you step out from as soon as you go. You may retreat back into one or two periods in your life, if you're having a baby or whatever. But it's a sort of second class realm, and anywheres tend to be very public realm oriented, both in the priority they give to professional life over the home, and also their interests, often highly political people. And of course, there's nothing wrong with that, but it means they tend to be comfortable with the undervaluing of the domestic realm, and tend to not be comfortable at looking at some of the negative effects. I mean, much of the Care Dilemma book is a sort of listing of the problems that have arisen from the undervaluing of the domestic realm, and and one of those, I talk about four main ones. The undervaluing of the domestic realm has led to much weaker and more unstable families. Nearly half of children in the UK are not living with both of their biological parents by the age of 14. I think that has undoubtedly contributed to the mental fragility epidemic, particularly among young people. I mean, I'm sure you follow the writings of Jonathan Haidt and others. And I mean, of course, the social media and the iPhone has played a role in that. Particularly young women sort of managing their young lives on TikTok can hardly be mentally healthy. But I think behind the social media problem lies, why is it that children are spending so much time on screens in the first place? It's because of the old structures of family life are not there. Having family meals together and so on, and having a more regulated family life in general. So you've got that, but you've got a whole range of almost any social problem in Britain today. You want to look at whether it's poverty. We're international outliers, by the way, in family instability, at least in Europe. We overlap quite a lot with the United States, but around 25% of all families with dependent children are single parent families. That contributes enormously to poverty. One of the reasons why we tend to be the most unequal society, one of the most unequal societies in Europe, is, well, we have an enormous financial sector, which tends to create very unequal incomes. But secondly, we have easily the most, of all the big countries, easily the most single-parent families. And that the weaker family also means much greater constant pressure to increase social spending on the part of the state. And of course, it also means two other enormous things. It means crashing fertility. If you've all your focus is on generating more GDP income and getting women and men out of the home as quickly as possible, back into jobs. I mean, our family policy is essentially about making it as easy for both parents to spend as little time in the family as possible. Our family policy is childcare policy, even though our childcare is absolutely massively expensive and very badly regulated. But so we have crashing fertility, and the final area that I focus on that I think we undervalue is face-to-face care jobs. The recruitment crisis. Again, we share this with most other rich countries. The recruitment crisis in social care, to some extent in nursing, even though nursing is now more or less a graduate-only profession, and in nursery care. I mean, all of these jobs that require a kind of emotional intelligence to do well, require dealing with people's emotions and their bodily fluids often. These are jobs that have historically been done by women in the home, so they tend to be when women have moved out of the home to do them in the public care economy, they've often done them part-time, so they've been historically undervalued. And it's kind of one of the curious things that modern feminism has done surprisingly little to raise the status of those jobs, partly because modern feminism has been a sort of male default kind of feminism. It's been about, so, when Jeremy Hunt was the Conservative Chancellor back in 2023, I think it was, introduced a huge new expansion, a huge new investment in childcare. He promising an extra £4 billion a year by this year, and expanding childcare so that parents, young mothers, would have 30 hours a week starting from the age of 9 months, something which is, by the way, quite controversial with many people who look at child development, certainly spending long hours at the age of 9 months in informal childcare is not something that is generally regarded as a healthy thing. But while he was announcing this expansion, he said women should not be wasting their talent staying at home. I mean, basically, women should not be wasting their talent on motherhood. It was rather an extraordinary thing for a Conservative Chancellor to be saying.
To say, yeah.
Yeah, but I think this is the sort of I call it. Well, it's not. I didn't coin the phrase, but this is a sort of a male default form of feminism. So it's about equality, but within the framework of a sort of traditional male society in a way, rather than on focusing as much on reproduction, if you like, as on production. Designing motherhood back into society, so that you have a sense of you're being supported. There's a village supporting you, whether it's your extended family or the community, or and we've placed very much less emphasis on that. So I think so the undervaluing of the domestic, I think it's very clear to look at. We can see all these consequences. Now the dilemma lies in the fact that much of that undervaluing has come as a function of what you might say is the biggest increase in human freedom since, 1945, has been the huge shift in women's roles, the huge shift from the domestic realm into at least part-time, and then latterly more like full-time, even when children are young, jobs in the and it obviously means that women are less defined by motherhood and marriage, and that has created much greater freedom for women. Women, and indeed men, are much freer to leave relationships that are abusive or oppressive in some way. And obviously society, has access to the energy and ambition and brains of women in a way that it didn't have 3 or 4 generations ago. So and there is no longer a kind of captive market in the labour market of women with low education who don't have very many opportunities, whose only option is to kind of work in a social care home or whatever, because women have greater opportunities.
Yeah.
That we're drawing on a much smaller pool of people to work in these places, so we have to make it more attractive. So that's the dilemma. I mean, the challenge is, how do we? I mean, just to finish my sort of book spiel, the challenge is, how do we raise the status of the family and care in the public economy, without rolling back any of those freedoms? And there are obvious things, we can go into these later, but men must step up more. Yes, I mean that is happening actually to a greater extent than men are often credited with. Certainly in the domestic realm, childcare is much more shared. Domestic work and we've moved from a sort of 70-30 balance women doing about 70% to men's 30%, something more like 60-40, or even in more educated homes, often something more like 55-45, where we haven't seen men moving so much into female majority jobs in the public care economy, partly because they're so low paid and low status. We've seen a much bigger shift of women into men's majority male areas because they're higher paid and higher status. We also need a real family policy. We could we could perhaps talk about what that might be, because we've got a pretty hopeless family policy at the moment.
We do.
Give women real choice over whether to be able to stay at home or not. I mean, very, very few people want to go back to the old, breadwinner homemaker divide. I think something like 9%, something like 9% of people in these social attitude surveys say that that's the way that we should run society. But equally, if you ask people what's the ideal arrangement for bringing up children, again, it's only 9% of people say both parents working full time. And yet this is the case in probably bringing up children, preschool children, I'm talking about, 1 to 4, 4.5. Only 9% of people think that is the ideal way of raising children preschool. And yet, nearly a third of mothers with preschool children are working full time. And many of them are very unhappy about it.
Yeah. I saw actually that in my earlier career, and it was that started me on the path of building a life of anywhere, I suppose, like a remote type of work, so I could build in the freedom to do what I wanted to do. But the freedom bit is the bit that I want to return to, and pick your brains over something, because I sometimes think, or I sometimes wonder whether it's an illusion of freedom. So we've essentially freed ourselves from the husbands, right? So as women, we can thrive in this life and in this liberal world on our own. But quite often we can't actually. We traded husbands for marrying the state. And we've traded being raised by mothers for being raised by the state. And we've traded as well the care for elderly people to the state. And to me, that also comes with the costs. That's not a total freedom. If you are relying on state, your choices are actually pretty bound. You need to stay on this trajectory of constantly doing what the state is expecting you to do, i.e., have a baby, come back to work ASAP, because all the incentive structures are set up in the way to get you to work as soon as humanly possible. So even though we've got, for example, quite generous maternity leave, when you compare it to something like United States, the incentives are still there for you to start dropping off that child from 3 months of age. And if you look at the nurseries offering, they do take kids from 3 months onwards. So you can see where the priority of the government is. I think for me, I don't see being married to the state throughout your entire life as a trade that was such a good value. I actually see that quite.
No, I agree. And it's not just the state, being married to the workplace.
Yes.
I mean, swapping the domestic realm, which tends to be painted these days as a suffocating, lonely place. And it probably has become lonelier because people have been through the economics, people have been, if you're paying the mortgage, living the lifestyle that you want to live, most households require at least 1.5, if not 2 incomes, 2 full incomes, as it were. And that means that people are spending a great deal more time at work, particularly women with young children, a great deal more time at work than they want to. And I know I'm friendly with a woman called Anne Fennell. I don't know if you know her, who runs this organisation, Mothers at Home Matter. And she's always making this point that you're much freer. I mean, if you could afford to do it, or if the state could actually give some support to parents, men as well as fathers as well as mothers who want to stay at home. And there are ways we can perhaps talk about this. I think there are ways in which one could redirect some of the current flows of support to make it easier for one parent to stay at home in those very stressful. It's also one of the reasons why so many relationships break up in those early years of parenthood, when you're working often full time. Both of you might be working full time, and you're trying to bring up one or two children. It's enormously stressful. And Anne always sort of says that actually, in some ways, her organisation is falsely described as mothers at home matter, because actually she says she spends incredibly little time at home. Being a mother with a couple of children is, you're out of the house the whole time. I mean, or you can be. It's not. We have, that world is not as rich as it used to be, because there are, in any community, particularly middle class communities, there, so many of the women are not there during the day. The children are in a nursery, and the women are, so that sense of there being a kind of a village that you're part of, that you're sharing the experience of childcare with other mothers is. But I think, well, I mean, I think part of what we should be struggling to achieve now is a recognition that something important was lost, and that we, again, we're not rolling back women's freedoms, but giving women and men more choice. And I think one way that you could do that very easily, we now, well, I touched on this earlier, we now spend £9 billion a year on childcare. Well, why not give that money direct to parents? Give that money direct to families to choose how they want to spend it. In many people, perhaps particularly professional women with, high achieving women with very well paid jobs, often these days better paid than their male partner, many of those women will want to continue, or will perhaps feel they have to continue at work, and so will want to use professional nursery care, and that's fine. But many other women would, and we know this from all the opinion surveys, these are official government opinion surveys that ask mothers of small children what their ideal arrangements are. And what is it? I think something like 2/3 of mothers this is women who are working. 2/3 of them say they prefer to work fewer hours if they could, and a third say they would prefer not to work at all if they could afford to. Now, if you took that £9 billion and distributed it among the parents with preschool children, if you also recognised the family in the tax system, which we don't do, or we do very, very marginally, and you have to be married. Again, we're international outliers in not doing that. And if you front-ended child benefit goes on to the age of 20 if your children are in full-time education. Why not pay half of it in the first 3 or 5 years? With that, you could very easily create a what I call a home carers allowance of about anything between about £8,000 and £10,000 a year. Now that would really make a difference to a lot of people. That would enable a lot of people to either work very part-time or not at all for the first few years of a child's life. And I think that would be incredibly welcome. It would help to reduce stress. It would reduce family breakdown. But it's not on the agenda of any political party.
No, I think more so as well that there are people perhaps that, a bit more like me, that have set up their life in a way where they can be drawing income from assets and things that they've built in the past. But now it's quite clear that Labour, for example, government will see me as not a working person.
Mm.
So I now need to change what I've done in terms of my strategy to make
Mm.
sure that I'm
Mm.
not like essentially being just robbed in taxes for all these things that I've built, so I can have freedom to stay at home with my kids. And I am very, very lucky. The decisions that I started making like 8 years ago have really paid off. My
Mm.
son doesn't need to go to nursery at all. He's 3 years and 5 months. And
Mm.
up until he turned 3 and a bit, he didn't spend even an hour at nursery. We had him at home with us all the time. And he was
Right.
just coming with us to, if I needed to go to the property that I was renovating, he was coming with me.
Mm.
So we were just dragging him everywhere. But it took me like solid 5 years to build that lifestyle where I
Mm.
could afford to take a pay cut. And I did take a pay cut because I wasn't working as much essentially. And I
Mm.
did wind up some of my businesses that required me to travel a lot, which I couldn't do. So, but I could do that and I could still survive. But it was sort of a sacrifice. And just the fact that I've built that, it just means that we don't get any then support from the state whatsoever in terms of
Mm.
like what it is that you are trying to do. And it is a shame because I think a lot of people are really trying to build a little bit of, financial backing behind them to then step away from that constant churn of, promotions and rat race and getting to the next job and all that. But
Mm.
it just
Mm.
feels like the minute you step away from like being in the system is starting to take away what you've built instead of just letting you sit on it for 5 years when your kids are younger. And
Mm. Mm.
there was a paragraph in your book where when I was reading it, I've probably reread it 10 times, and it is about this constant guilt that mothers feel of wanting to stay at home, but then when they are at home, missing something from outside. And I think a
Mm.
lot of
Mm.
mothers being pulled then to careers. But
Mm.
so I sometimes wonder whether we are being pulled to the careers when we are actually looking for that connection with community. And because we don't
Mm.
have that anymore, we don't
Exactly.
have the
Yeah. Yeah.
village.
Yeah.
Like I sometimes wonder whether I would be still as ambitious to sort of, achieve my
Mm.
career goals, if you like, if I
Yeah.
had five of my best friends literally in the village where I live with the young kids, where we could just do the things that we wanted to do with the kids. I
Yeah.
probably
Yeah.
would have taken a way step back from what I'm doing. And I sometimes feel like the career, the sort of the wanting to go back to work
Mm.
isn't wanting to go back to work. It's actually escaping the loneliness that we've created just by the way that we live our lives right now, separate from the
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
family, separate
Yeah.
from the community.
Yeah. I mean, women are status-seeking creatures, just like men, and if all the status in society is in the professional world of work, all the status, all the money, then women are going to be drawn towards that. And as you say, that then creates a sort of a sort of vicious cycle in which there are fewer and fewer people in the village. I mean, bringing up children can be very hard. It can be very boring, and it is made easier, if you have help from extended family and help from friends and a community. And also, I mean, they're obviously, just like, the men have, there are very different kinds of men with very different temperaments. There are very different kinds of women with different temperaments too. And there are some women who may want to have children, but will always find it perhaps more difficult than other women find it. But there are some women who are kind of more naturally maternal, if you like, and
Mm-hmm.
some women who are less. There's an interesting you know, what's her name? The academic woman, Catherine Hakim, produced some work a few years ago now. She talked about British women being divided between 20% who are very work focused. That included obviously often successful women, women who are climbing the greasy pole in organisations, who are work focused, but perhaps in many cases, not all, but in many cases, wanted and had families too. And then you had 20%, an equal 20% who are very, very almost exclusively family focused, and 60% who I think she called adaptive, who obviously who want to balance both family and productive and hopefully interesting work, but when children were very young, wanted to prioritize looking after small children, and I think you can see that that it tends to, public policy has been much more determined on these themes by the 20% of very highly work-focused women than by the 20% of family-focused, or indeed the 60% of adaptive women. And I think that is a shame. And like I say, I think this is probably this issue represents, I think, now in the broader sense of the kind of undervaluing of the domestic, the inability to regard family structure as a subject of policy, of politics or policy. It's essentially regarded as beyond politics. The fact that we have this terrible record of family breakdown, disproportionate proportion of single parent families and so on, it's just regarded as beyond politics. It's just something we have to live with.
It's a lifestyle choice. Yeah.
And it's sort of too dangerous for anyone to get there. But I think that all of this represents the biggest gap in our politics between the political class and the ordinary citizens, who do regard the stable family as a desirable thing that we should aim for, and would like policy to, difficult though it is. I mean, no one's saying this is easy. Once people are free, we don't believe in God any longer, or not to the same extent. We don't have those very, very fixed moral norms that we would have done 100 years ago. Freedom is is a powerful force, and people like it. But we kind of need help to balance that freedom with other things, and public policy is not there to help us achieve that better balance that I think most people want between freedom and the things that in the longer term give life meaning, like raising children and looking after one's elderly parents properly, and these things that are perhaps more demanding now than they would have been 50 or 100 years ago, precisely because ordinary life has so many more thrills in it. I think it's one of the simplest explanations for the crash in fertility is just is freedom, and the fact that a childless 30-year-old woman today has, well, unlike a childless 30-year-old woman 100 years ago, she would have had a high level of freedom in her life for probably since her late teens, would have probably since her early 20s, would have probably lived on her own, had her own job, her own income, and so on. Has an experience of life that would be very similar to a young man of the same age, which probably wouldn't have been the case 100 years ago. And not only that, but has, even if you're on a relatively modest income, I mean, just think of the the travel opportunities, the cheap airfares, you can, if you've got a reasonable income, you can go off for long weekends to, lovely islands in the Mediterranean without really thinking about it. Think of the extraordinary entertainment that, all these streaming channels that are there at the flick of a switch at very, very low cost, all the emphasis on preparing beautiful food. And, life has got a lot better and you might say for a parent, if anything, it's the other way round. Intensive parenting, the idea that parenting is something you really have to work hard at in order to get your child, into the safety zone of the A-level stream and university and a professional job. That many people, many ordinary people in the middle of society, we're not talking about the elites particularly, there is that extra, parenting has got more, having children has got more difficult in many ways, and not having children has got easier. But, the people that decide, the couples or young women on their own who decide not, I think many people do regret, the childlessness proportion is rising. It's actually surprising. One of the surprising things I discovered writing the book is actually historically it's been quite high. That historically about 15% of women, 15 to 20% even of women, going back hundreds of years, have not had children. Many of those women went into the church or into caring roles of various kinds in nursing, teaching, and so on. It then fell with the post-war baby boom. It fell to a low point of about 10% of women were childless, and it's now creeping back up to 20%. And quite a lot of that childlessness will be unwanted childlessness because people, partly for the reasons I just gave, people. I think a young woman has grounds in a way for feeling more wary about dependence than perhaps in previous generations, where you were sort of you were socialized to expect dependence. But having tasted of independence, and nothing makes you more dependent in some ways than having a child. You're dependent on your partner, on your family, or as you say, the state, which is not always a comfortable position to be in either. And that fear of dependence, I think, puts people off taking the plunge, and then finding maybe it's too late. The education system. If you're a middle class person, you go to university, you may do a postgraduate degree, you then get established in your profession. That may take another 5 years. Suddenly, you're in your early 30s before you know it, and maybe you had a relationship and it's just ended, and it may take you a year or two to find somebody who you'd be comfortable having a family with, and then you're 33, 34, and you're already a geriatric mother, and you may find that it's too late to have more than one child, or even one child.
That's largely a story of my life there. But this is my personal bias, but I do think that it plays a role, because nowadays we do have a society with a very extensive menu of hedonistic pleasures that we could chase at a very low cost, like you mentioned. But my generation, sort of the millennials, they are the product of the divorce boom that started happening. And if you asked me, even in my late 20s, whether I wanted to have a child, I would be absolutely not. I was not interested in any of it. And it took two massive life events that are not going to be common. I was diagnosed with cancer in my mid-20s. So I was pretty much told that I've got about 6 months to live. And that changed a lot of my sort of outlook on life. And that's when I sort of started, okay, I need freedom in my life. I need to be free from careers. I need to build the type of jobs that I can just stay at home, blah, blah, blah. And it's only a couple of years after that, I even opened the possibility of wanting to have a child. But it wasn't until I sort of got out of the relationship, which was going nowhere, and I've met someone, and I was like, right, I want to have a child, like, now. And, you know, it was, we met when I was 33. We had our first child when I was 34. But so I sort of see a lot of these driven, ambitious women as potentially, you know, are they doing a little bit like what I've done? That it was essentially a bit like maybe not wanting to repeat the mistakes of my parents and all that, not wanting to have a life like they had. That is then stopping us to even open ourselves to the vulnerability of having a kid with someone, because then you are dependent. You are tied to that person forever once you had a kid with them. Even if, you know, the sort of the marriage doesn't last, but then there is then as much data behind the fact that the kids do so much better when they do stay sort of in the two parent homes. And I think a lot of that sort of just sits on top of each other. So we've got multi-layers of reasons why this is happening. But I've got a suspicion that the boom of divorces that started probably sort of 1970s, 1980s is behind some of the choices that millennials started to make or not make.
Exactly. They're very cautious about commitment, and particularly the kind of commitment involved in not just settling down with a partner, but then having children with them. You know, you want to be absolutely sure, and you want to make sure that you have the ability to support yourself, because you know you cannot trust relationships in the long term, because you saw what happened to your parents, maybe, or to so many of the people you know. I think there are lots of things that are feeding into this so-called crisis of intimacy.
I think it then starts to compound the issue that we've got in the future, because the dropping fertility rates means that there is way more older people turning 60 and they are childless. And this is something that I actually took the note because that statistic blew me away. By 2030, which is 5 years from now, 2 million people over age 65 will be childless already. And we are not a massive country in the UK when it comes to the population. That is going to be increasing exponentially. And then that obviously puts even more pressure on the state to deliver the care for the elderly, which is even more expensive than the care for the little ones.
Yeah.
So,
and it's surprising how few people are in. You know, we talk a lot about social care, the failure to reform social care and domiciliary care. We kind of assume that most people over 75 or 80 are in the care system. They're not. It's quite a small proportion. There are about 500,000 people who are in the elderly care system, either in a care home or receiving a visit 2 or 3 times a day from domiciliary carers. And there are, I think it's about 5 million people over the age of 75 and 1.5 million people over the age of 85. So we're talking about, and a lot of those people are receiving care from family members.
yeah.
But as you point out, the rise in childlessness, or just the rise in single child families too, and the greater dispersal of families, again, partly going back to this point about higher education, we're a more dispersed, and this is only the last 30, 40 years, since the creation of mass higher education, mass residential higher education, the middle and upper classes have become much more dispersed across the country. So you're much less likely. It's another reason why the kind of the child having a child calculus has more negative aspects to it, because your mother, the grandparents are less likely to live around the corner than would have been the case a generation or two ago. So that sort of dispersal factor. So more and more. So a huge number of people at the moment are still being looked after by family members. Informal care. More than 5 million people are said to be involved in the informal care system. I think 2 or 3 million of them receive some minimal care allowance to recompense them in a small way for it. But I mean that number of carers is shrinking, if anything, because of childlessness, because of family dispersal. So people are going to be leaning more and more on the state. That means that taxes are going to have to stay high or go even higher to pay for that public care. And there are these sort of vicious circles all over the place arising from. It's a sort of short-termism. It's a sort of civilizational short-termism, as I say in the book, that we put all the pressure, all the emphasis on maximizing employment and GDP growth now, including with sucking in millions of often quite low-skilled immigrants without giving a thought to what's going to happen in the future. We're making it harder for people to raise the sort of stable, well-balanced citizens of the future by forcing them all out to work today to boost. GDP growth is not an end in itself; it's a means to an end. The end is human flourishing and human well-being, and we've kind of lost sight of that. I actually wrote a piece in the Spectator. I've got a rather eminent economist uncle called Charles Goodhart, who he invented something called Goodhart's Law, which, however many books I write, I will never get above him in the Google rankings, because Goodhart's Law is so well known. But he's actually a financial economist, really. I mean, he's now an old man himself. He's in his late 80s. But he's got interested in the economics of care, partly because his dear wife, Miffy, my Aunt Miffy, got very serious dementia a few years ago and is now in a home. And he's sort of turned his professional attention somewhat in the direction of the economics of care. And he and I wrote a piece about the increasingly damaging way in which GDP thinking is sort of distorting policymakers' decision making. And if you just think about, we've always known, obviously, that GDP never counted lots of valuable productive work. All the productive work that was being done in the home doesn't count towards GDP. A car crash causes GDP to rise because of people have to buy new cars and all the work involved in scraping somebody off the motorway. So we've known that GDP is always has quite a narrow focus, but the problem, or rather the tension between GDP economics and, as it were, human economics or human flourishing, is becoming greater. So let me just give you this example. Say, and this must be happening in hundreds of thousands of homes across the country. Somebody on a decent income in their late 50s, early 60s, say they're a project manager or a management consultant, say they're earning 100, 120 grand a year, or say 100 grand for convenience. but they have an elderly parent who they love, and whose care they care about, who is becoming increasingly infirm. They're in their mid to late 80s. They need support. The elderly person really doesn't want to go into a home, even if they could afford a decent home. And so the son or daughter, the professional person on 100 grand a year, decides to go half time in order to look after their elderly parent. So the GDP economy loses £50,000, but the well-being probably both of those people rises, and the state also saves if that elderly person qualified for support. I mean, it costs about £50,000 a year of public support to put somebody in a care home. So, and more of those cases are happening all the time. So, the sort of GDP, the emphasis on GDP growth in an aging society, and in an aging society with a fertility crisis too, because small children need looking after at home, which detracts from the GDP economy. So again, we're misaligning our priorities there. Anyway, I mean, I do think we're sort of setting ourselves up to fail with the way in which sort of GDP completely dominates the public mind on all of this, is something we've got to sort of wean ourselves off. And there's also, if you look at what's happened over the last 50 or 60 years, the great movement of women from the home into the workforce at all levels, from the job to the highest, the ordinary job in retail or whatever, to the highest professional pinnacles. There's a sort of false accounting involved in it. It's counted as a pure plus to GDP, along with the fact that you had a huge expansion of the white goods industry as women moved from the home to the workplace. There was obviously greater demand for labor saving devices in the home, so you had this sort of double boost to the GDP economy, a double and unrepeatable boost. I mean, it's one of the things that we forget that when we look at the relatively slow growth today, that usually there has been something that's been kind of motoring growth, GDP growth in recent years. And so from the sort of 60s through to the 90s, that thing was women moving into the GDP economy. Plus the white goods industry, and what was happening? You have this one job becomes three jobs essentially. So you had the old breadwinner homemaker economy, where you had one worker. You then moved to a two breadwinners. Both parents are working, and they need somebody to look after the child. So you've got three jobs where there was one before. And of course, that's a good thing in many ways, but it's a sort of it kind of exaggerates the real growth. A lot of it is just unbundling what was sort of being done before.
I do find that a lot of things that the government is trying to raise the GDP for is just wasteful. And if they just started looking at reducing some of that waste and actually investing differently. So, if they invested into perhaps more parents staying with the children, would we see the criminality go down?
Exactly. Yeah.
We probably know that, yes, we would, especially on the male side, because young males seem to be going that way. If they are going to be rebelling, they tend to go into sort of criminality. But I can't see many politicians looking forward. They just look at, like you said, raising GDP as if it was this level of just human success and flourishing, which it clearly isn't. You've sort of outlined the potential solutions to the problem and what we could start doing to reform the system. We won't have time to get through all of it, but I wanted to really gauge your opinion on whether our current government and the direction that they are going to is actually going to start scratching at addressing these issues, or is it just going to be the ballooning of the GDP to try and cover up for the fact that they just don't have the solutions, or they don't have the guts to address the problems down the road?
I think it very unlikely that we will see any moves in this direction. I mean, Bridget Phillipson has talked about, well, when I say this direction, I mean raising the status of the domestic sphere, talking about the family more honestly, talking about the importance of the two-parent family. Family structure really does matter. I think this is very unlikely to happen from this government. If anything, I think they will continue to go further in the direction that the Conservatives. I mean, this is a cross-party consensus, really, that we cannot talk about the effect of unstable family life on all those things you just mentioned. The prison population, the vast majority of people in prison are there because they come from broken homes. They had terrible early experiences in the family. The educational failure for families stands right behind that. The housing crisis is, the fact that you have so many families splitting up means you need double the houses to house people, etc., etc. It's extremely unlikely that people are going to look at any of these some of the things we talked about, like the home care allowance, making it easier, reducing the stress in the early years of parenthood, making it possible for a mother or indeed a father to stay at home when children are preschool. I think the emphasis will continue to be almost entirely on childcare, not only childcare, but essentially government subsidized childcare. Also, it's hugely over-regulated, as you probably know. I mean, the child minding sector has been almost regulated out of existence because they've kind of got regulation wrong in all sorts of complicated ways. The idea that we might try and lean against the increase in single parenthood, I think, is also extremely unlikely. Bridget Phillipson, the responsible minister, is herself from a single parent family. Wes Streeting is from a single parent family. And they tend to take the view that it's not the structure of the family that matters. It's just the sort of quality of the love that you receive when you're very young. Well, yes, obviously, nobody's stigmatizing single parent homes any longer, thankfully. But there's a huge support in public opinion for support for the two-parent family. Everybody recognises that is a far better way to bring children up. I mean, all we're likely to get is an expansion. Bridget Phillipson, I think, is talking about more wraparound, more nursery care attached to school, to primary schools and so on. And that's not a bad thing. I mean, if they can, we need a decent system of childcare. Nobody's denying that. But it's all, it's those other more almost taboo things to talk about. That I think the only hope is that that it's one of the issues that the Conservative Party might rebuild itself around. I don't think they've really said anything in this area so far since Kemi Badenoch became leader. It is, I think for Labour, I'd be amazed if a Labour government which it sees itself as the sort of the party in some ways of sort of 1970s, 1980s feminism, and regards women as fully free only when they're able to fully participate in the public realm. And it promotes a kind of male default feminism, and that means that we're not going to look at these issues certainly in the next 4 years. But I think it's a sort of issue that's lying out there to be picked up by some political force, maybe reform. I don't know. And the funny thing about it is that it's actually a lot of these issues. The goals may sound sort of conservative in a way. I mean, although I think they're merely
But they are not, are
commonsensical.
they? You can't have a welfare state unless you've got a population and a productive economy.
Exactly, yeah, and people to pay the taxes to fund the welfare state, and it's common sense to try and promote a stable two-parent families rather than regard it as outside the realm of politics. But oddly enough, a lot of the goals of higher fertility, more stable family life, etc., really require sort of liberal means to reach them. I mean, we'll have more fertile families if we have a better balance in the family. If men do step up and play a greater role, I think there's some evidence that that you tend to get higher fertility in families, or indeed in countries where there's more equality between the sexes. We need proper target, another sort of, you might say, liberal or progressive proper targeting of support, particularly in the bottom half of the income spectrum, because it's really in the bottom half of the income spectrum that the family is most chaotic and most unstable. Even though the attitudes of people in the bottom half of the income spectrum are often more small c conservative in these areas, but it tends to be the more educated professional class people who sort of talk a very liberal game about the family, but actually have more traditional arrangements themselves. Whereas it's the other way round often in the bottom half of the income spectrum. But something like the kind of the anti-couple bias in the welfare system, and of course none of these things I'm talking about would come cheap. But say a single parent mother meets somebody, has a new potentially stable relationship with a partner, but the risk of making that partnership sort of official is very high, because the man, assuming it is a man, gets no benefit in the tax system, because we don't recognise the family in the tax system, gets no benefit in the tax system for joining forces with this woman with one or two children. The woman immediately, if this relationship is declared, this is assuming the man is earning a kind of reasonable amount, the woman would lose all of her benefits. So we must, there must be ways. I talk in one of the chapters about phasing in, so that people ought to be able to establish new relationships. Of course, what happens at the moment is people just lie about it.
Yeah.
But people ought to be able to establish new relationships and have a probationary period of 6 months or even a year when they can keep some or all of their previous arrangements. And then when they are confident this is going to be a real thing, then they move onto a new system and don't receive the same benefits any longer, but ought to then be able to receive other
It's
forms
again
of
the incentives as well, because there is already a broken family. For that family unit, it would be better if they re-established some sort of stability. But just that benefit system, as you explained it, keeps them. the incentive is there for that family to stay broken instead of
Yeah, exactly.
re-establishing
Yeah.
stability ASAP. And again, it's kicking the costs
Yeah.
further down the line.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, well, I think we are not going to get time to go into all of the solutions that you actually have to, what the government could do to fix the care for the elderly. So for that, I highly recommend that people get your book, The Care Dilemma. And for the people that want to follow what you are doing, where can they find you online, and what are you working on now?
Well, I don't have a Substack or a website. I mean, I just write write books every few years. Do some journalism. I am on Twitter. I've never been on Facebook. When Facebook came along, it was sort of for kids, and my kids were on it, and then it became for adults. But I kind of missed out that stage. The one thing I have recently joined, because a friend of mine kept saying, if you want to promote your book and so on, you should be on LinkedIn. So I'm on LinkedIn. Um, although I haven't really it's very complicated, LinkedIn. I don't know quite how to sort of use it. But I'm on Twitter, and I'm under I think I'm at David _Goodhart. And yeah, that's what am I working on? I'm still sort of working on sort of selling the last book. I'm doing events on the care dilemma. I'm one thing I'm actually thinking about is it's a sort of business idea. I've always thought that the internet, one really positive pro-social aspect of the internet ought to be that it should make just-in-time volunteering a lot easier. I remember when I had kids. I've got 4 children, and when they were young, I would occasionally, and perhaps I was more idealistic in those days, I would think, the grandparent, the grandma's going to have them on Sunday. I've got 2 hours, 3 hours spare. I could. There would be somebody up the road, some old granny who would like her lawn mown, or some painting done in her kitchen or something. It ought to be so easy, and obviously there are lots of ways, lots of websites and apps that bring volunteers and the people who want volunteers, whether it's individual, mainly old people, or I don't know, hospices or care homes or schools or whatever, or organisations that need volunteers of various kinds. But there ought to be a kind of national platform. I mean, you need to have a kind of Facebook-like sort of brand that everybody knows. They can just go onto it. Now there's all there's the DBS issues, and obviously there are security issues. And as I say, there are lots of volunteering websites, but they tend to be very sort of specific. They're very local, and I think the key is this just in time thing, that you're not somebody. Say you're very busy, you can't afford to be tied down to a regular 2 hour slot every fortnight or whatever. But every now and then, you've got a couple of hours. You could just go online, see that there, some in your postcode area, there is, there's a care home that wants somebody to come in and read to old people, or whatever it is. And then off you go and you do it, and it might be that might then turn into something that becomes more stable and permanent.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm kind of I suspect people have tried to do this and it's failed. I mean, I haven't really started researching it yet, but it's one of the things I want to look at. It's the kind of thing that governments should do, but they don't seem to have done it, or not. I mean, I don't know of any government that has done it in a society like ours. In which case, you sort of have to do it you'd have to do. I mean, you'd probably have to charge people to register. I mean, a small amount. You know, if you charge people sort of 20 quid or whatever to register, and you got a few 100,000 people doing it, then you could. You know, even if you do it as a charity, you'd need a proper business plan and some proper funding to get it set up. But anyway, that's sort of one of the things I've been thinking about.
Well, good luck with it. It could fill a lot of the gaps, and the gaps that are going to be only widening in the future. So perhaps it's one of these things again, like with your anywheres and somewheres, that you might just time it well if you continue thinking about it. So, ladies and gentlemen, I give you David Goodhart. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Kat. Bye-bye then.
Thank you for tuning in to Wisdom Rebellion. Before you go, if you enjoyed the conversation, please consider subscribing. It massively helps with keeping the show on the road so we can all build a wiser world together. And if you loved this video, you will also love this one. I'll see you there.